There is a quiet conflict that lives inside almost every human being, a subtle tension between the self that breathes in private and the self that steps out into the world wearing a practiced smile. Most people never speak about it, yet they feel it, in the heaviness after social moments, in the silence of their rooms, in the way their chest tightens when they realize they played a role instead of being themselves. This unseen conflict is not loud. It does not break doors or shout its name. It moves softly, like a shadow, following everything one does. And over time, it shapes how a person sees their own worth, who they are, who they pretend to be, and the painful poetic distance between the two. There is a moment in every person's life when they begin to sense it, the subtle distance between their inner world and the version of themselves that others see. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic revelation. It appears quietly, softly, often in the pauses between conversations, or in the gentle ache that follows a day spent performing roles no one asked them to play out loud. The mask never feels heavy at first. In childhood, it forms like a thin layer of dust, settling so lightly that one hardly notices it. A smile held a little longer than natural, a nod offered in agreement when the heart disagreed, a small silence swallowing a truth that felt too delicate to expose. These tiny adjustments feel harmless, they even feel necessary, and in their simplicity, they become the beginning of a lifelong habit, shaping oneself to fit safely into the world. People learn early that being fully seen can be risky. That honesty sometimes invites judgment. That vulnerability, when misunderstood, can hurt. So, the mask grows in response to these moments, not out of deceit, but out of protection. It becomes a tool for belonging, a shield against rejection, a performance refined over years of subtle observations. What earns approval? What avoids conflict? What keeps the peace? By adolescence, the mask becomes almost natural. It blends with the voice one uses in groups, the laughter that rises on cue, the confident posture worn like borrowed clothing. On the outside, it looks like adaptation. On the inside, it feels like quiet distance, a sense that the person moving through the world is familiar, yet somehow not fully you. Most people never question it. They call it personality. They call it fitting in. But beneath the surface, the mask slowly develops weight, and with time, that weight becomes a tension the body learns to carry. It shows up in the fatigue after social interactions that should have felt easy. It appears in the small relief a person feels when they are finally alone, as if they can breathe a little more deeply in their own presence. It reveals itself in the moments when the real self tries to emerge, a spontaneous thought, an honest emotion, but is quickly pulled back by the instinct to stay acceptable, likable, predictable. The mask becomes so practiced that others begin to trust it more than the true self beneath it. Friends recognize the version that smiles effortlessly. Family sees the version that doesn't create waves. Society praises the version that succeeds, performs, and fits the mold. But deep down, a quiet truth remains. When a person is known only for the mask, they begin to feel unknown in the most intimate way. There are days when the conflict is barely noticeable, a whisper in the background. And there are days when it grows louder, a sense of disconnect, a feeling of loneliness in crowded rooms, a strange sadness that has no clear source. It is the sadness of self-betrayal, the ache of watching oneself act out a life that does not fully align with the heart's quiet desires. Yet even in this conflict, there is no blame. The mask was learned for a reason. It was crafted to keep the child safe, to help the teenager survive, to allow the adult to navigate a complex world that rarely welcomes unfiltered humanity. But awareness begins in moments like these, when a person starts to notice the split, the effort, the exhaustion, when they realize that the version they project to the world is not a lie, but also not the whole truth. And it is in that subtle noticing, that soft discomfort, that the journey begins. Understanding the mask, understanding the self beneath it, and recognizing the quiet conflict between the two. Before a person learns to pretend, they learn to observe. A child enters the world without masks, without pretense, pure, unfiltered, and unashamed of their needs. Their emotions arrive honestly, like weather moving across an open sky. But slowly, through the subtle lessons of family, culture, and survival, they begin to notice which parts of themselves are welcomed, and which parts quietly disturb the room. The pretender is born in these tiny, unspoken moments, not from deliberate choice, but from necessity. A child cries, and someone calls it too much. They ask a question, and someone laughs instead of answering. They express sadness, and someone tells them to be strong. They show fear, and someone asks them to stop being sensitive. Each moment teaches the same silent rule. Some emotions are acceptable. Others must be hidden. And so, the child begins to trim pieces of themselves, like cutting branches from a growing tree, so it fits neatly into a small, expected shape. They learn which behaviors earn warmth, which ones earn distance, which ones create harmony, which ones create tension. The pretender grows through mimicry. A child watches how their parents behave, the way they smile politely despite frustration, the way they suppress anger to keep peace, the way they downplay their own needs to appear strong. These patterns sink in quietly, becoming emotional blueprints. This is how you should be. This is how you survive. By school age, the mask takes clearer form. Children begin to see the power of acceptance and the sting of exclusion. The desire to belong shapes their behavior as much as fear once did. They learn to play safe roles: the quiet one, the funny one, the accommodating one, the achiever. Each role is less about authenticity and more about securing a place in the social world. The pretender takes on responsibility. It becomes the protector against judgment. It acts as a negotiator in moments of conflict. It shields the child from rejection by giving others a version that feels easier to love. But beneath the protection lies a small cost. The real self slowly moves into the background, waiting for safer conditions to reappear. As the person grows older, the pretender evolves. In adolescence, it becomes more complex, responding to new expectations, fitting into groups, avoiding embarrassment, earning admiration, maintaining an identity that feels presentable. Teenagers rarely realize how much of their behavior is shaped by fear: fear of standing out, fear of being unliked, fear of being misunderstood. By adulthood, the pretender becomes almost indistinguishable from the self. It speaks confidently in meetings. It performs competence even when overwhelmed. It nods in agreement to avoid conflict. It acts strong to avoid appearing fragile. It holds back tears because vulnerability feels unsafe. It smiles when sadness is the truth. Society rewards the pretender generously. The world values those who can adapt, perform, and manage their image. Professional environments encourage polish over honesty. Social circles favor consistency over complexity. Cultural expectations reinforce roles: the dependable one, the successful one, the resilient one, roles that may not reflect the depth of a person's inner life. This is how the false self becomes reinforced, normalized, even admired. But deep inside, the authentic self doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quieter, whispering beneath the noise of expectations. It shows up in moments of genuine laughter, in rare conversations where the heart feels safe, in the private thoughts a person never says aloud. It also shows up through discomfort, through the exhaustion that comes from constant performance, through the longing to be understood without having to explain, through the subtle grief of feeling unknown in a life full of people. The pretender is not the enemy. It was created to protect. It helped the child survive. It helped the teenager belong. It helps the adult navigate a complex world. But the cost of that protection becomes clearer with time, because somewhere along the journey, the person realizes that the mask they created for safety has become the barrier blocking them from their own truth, and the self beneath begins to call for recognition. To understand the conflict between who a person is and who they pretend to be, the mind must be viewed as a landscape with two distinct regions: the self that develops naturally and the self that develops strategically. Psychology has long studied this divide. In different theories, it appears with different names: the persona and the shadow, the authentic self and the adapted self, the true self and the false self. But no matter the terminology, the pattern remains universal. Human beings do not split accidentally. They split to survive. Attachment theory explains how early relationships shape the internal world. When a child receives consistent warmth and emotional attunement, their authentic self learns to exist openly. When the response is unpredictable, loving at times, distant at others, the child begins modifying themselves to maintain connection. They become hyper-aware of the emotional climate, adjusting their behavior to avoid displeasure. Over time, this adaptive self becomes the foundation of the persona. Cognitive dissonance, another psychological concept, helps explain the tension that emerges later. The mind struggles when a person's actions don't align with their inner truth. To reduce discomfort, the person suppresses certain emotions or rationalizes behaviors that don't feel natural. The mask becomes reinforced, not only socially, but neurologically. Each instance of pretending wires the brain a little more tightly into the performance. Carl Jung described this phenomenon as the formation of the shadow. Every trait a person feels is unacceptable or unsafe is pushed into the unconscious. Sensitivity, anger, vulnerability, curiosity, fear. These hidden parts do not disappear. They simply retreat, waiting for safe conditions to re-emerge. But suppressed emotions don't remain still. They move beneath the surface like quiet currents, influencing reactions, shaping relationships, and creating inner contradictions the person can't always explain. Modern identity theory expands this further. It shows that people create multiple selves to function in different environments. The work self, the family self, the social self, the private self. For most, these selves overlap harmoniously. But when the gap becomes too wide, when the public self is polished and the private self is aching, the split becomes emotionally costly. The neurobiology behind this divide is equally revealing. Pretending requires effort. The brain uses executive functions, the same mental resources needed for focus and self-control, to maintain the mask. This is why social exhaustion is common among people who feel disconnected from their authentic identity. It is not simply shyness or introversion. It is cognitive strain. The mind tires when it must constantly monitor tone, expression, and behavior to avoid revealing too much. Emotional suppression further complicates the picture. When feelings are consistently pushed down, the body often absorbs the consequences. Increased heart rate, muscle tension, shallow breathing. These subtle physiological signals are the body's way of expressing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. The split self is not sustainable without a cost. And yet, despite the discomfort, many people cling to their persona because the alternative feels frightening. Authenticity requires exposure. It requires showing parts of oneself that were criticized or misunderstood in the past. The mind associates authenticity with risk, rejection, embarrassment, or loss of belonging. So, the adapted self steps in again, whispering convincing narratives. People prefer this version of you. Don't say that. It might upset someone. Stay agreeable. It's safer. Don't be too emotional. It makes you look weak. These thoughts are not flaws. They are protective mechanisms shaped by old experiences. The adapted self once kept the person safe, and the brain remembers that safety. But problems arise when the adapted self begins to dominate the entire identity, when the persona becomes so polished that no one notices the exhaustion underneath, when the shadow grows so full that the person begins to feel hollow, when the real self becomes so quiet that even the person themselves wonders who they are beneath the performance. This is the psychology of the split self, a coping mechanism that becomes a conflict, a mask that becomes a mirror, a performance that becomes a prison. Yet even here, in this complexity, there is hope. Because what becomes divided can also be understood. What becomes concealed can eventually be reclaimed. And the journey toward that reclamation begins with noticing the inner tension not as a flaw, but as a signal. The self beneath the mask is ready to be seen again. There comes a point when the mask that once felt protective begins to feel constricting, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like clothing that becomes too tight over the years. At first, the person tries to adjust. They tell themselves it's normal, that everyone performs, that being accepted matters more than being known. But the body senses the truth long before the mind is ready to admit it. Pretending becomes a prison when it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the only way to exist. The conflict shows up quietly, in the way the person hesitates before speaking, scanning the room for what version of themselves is safest, in the way they rehearse conversations that should feel natural, in the way they feel a strange emptiness after social interactions, a hollowness that whispers, "You were there, but not really." The prison tightens further in relationships. People may admire the persona, rely on it, even love it. But the deeper unspoken fear grows. They love the version you show them, not the self you hide. This fear becomes a silent barrier, held in place by years of self-protection. The person continues playing roles because the thought of being fully seen feels more dangerous than the loneliness of being misunderstood. Over time, the mask demands upkeep. It requires constant vigilance, adjusting behaviors, managing impressions, hiding emotions that might make others uncomfortable. The adapted self becomes a full-time performance, carefully maintained with smiles, agreeable words, and the practiced art of seeming fine. Yet beneath the surface, the real self resists confinement. It shows up through small rebellions, a truth that slips out too honestly, a moment of emotion that cracks through the practiced calm, a sudden irritation at being misunderstood, even though the person never revealed their real feelings. These cracks feel confusing, embarrassing, even frightening. But they are signs of something important. The inner self pushing against the walls that contain it. The conflict grows sharper when the person begins recognizing the emotional weight of the mask. There is a fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, a longing for conversations where no performance is needed, a desire to be known in ways that feel impossible from behind carefully curated behavior. Some people describe it as living behind glass, visible but unreachable. Others call it numbness or burnout, or a persistent sense that life feels like a script rather than a lived experience. Psychologically, this is the point where the gap between the authentic self and the adapted self becomes unsustainably wide. The persona continues functioning, smiling, working, engaging, but internally, the person feels disconnected from their own life. They observe themselves performing in real time, aware that something is missing, but unsure what it is. Resistance emerges here too. The mind doesn't surrender easily. It warns, if you stop pretending, you might lose people. If you show your real feelings, you might be judged. If you change, others might not understand. Fear becomes the guardrail keeping the person in the prison, even when they desperately want out. At this stage, many individuals begin mistaking their persona for their identity. They forget who they were before the pretending began. They question their preferences, their desires, their values. They fear that without the mask, there may be nothing worth revealing, but this fear is not a sign of emptiness. It is the echo of a self that has been silenced for too long. And beneath that fear lies something softer, a quiet ache, almost like grief. Grief for the parts of themselves that were never allowed to grow. Grief for the emotions they muted. Grief for the authenticity they postponed in the name of fitting in. This is the prison. Not a cage made by others, but a cage built slowly, unintentionally, through years of self-protection. And yet, the human spirit does not stay confined forever. There comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, when the walls begin to crack, when pretending can no longer conceal the longing for truth, when the conflict becomes too loud to ignore. This moment marks the beginning of change, not because the person is ready, but because something inside them refuses to remain hidden any longer.